Hey guys, what makes medieval travel so interesting is that, from a distance, it can seem almost romantic. A rider on a narrow road, a pilgrim with a staff, a merchant moving between ancient towns. But for most people who actually had to do it, the reality was slower, dirtier, more exhausting, and far less certain than the picture we usually inherit. So before we settle in, tell me where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like me to cover next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a quiet like on the video really does help support the channel. And if you'd like more calm, curious journeys into the past, subscribing is a simple way to stay with us. Now, to understand why medieval travel felt so hard, we have to set aside the postcard version of the Middle Ages and return to the practical question that shaped everything. Not where people wanted to go, but what the road, the weather, the season, the animal under them, and the world around them would allow. One of the easiest mistakes modern people make is to imagine that a road was simply a road. In medieval Europe, that was rarely true in the modern sense. There were famous routes, old Roman roads in some regions, bridges maintained by lords, towns, monasteries, or kings, and well-used tracks known to merchants and pilgrims. But a great many routes were not smooth, engineered corridors designed for predictable movement. They were vulnerable surfaces shaped by rain, ruts, mud, local neglect, and the simple fact that most pre-modern societies did not possess the kind of continuous transport infrastructure we now take for granted. In some areas, earlier Roman construction still mattered. In many others, people moved across a patchwork of maintained stretches, worn paths, river crossings, and difficult approaches that changed with the seasons. Medieval authorities did at times legislate for highways and bridges, and communities could be obligated to maintain them, but obligation was not the same thing as comfort. That helps explain the first part of the puzzle. Travel was slow not because medieval people were especially passive, unadventurous, or technically ignorant, but because movement depended on surfaces that often resisted speed. A mounted messenger on urgent business could move far faster than an ordinary traveler, and certain official or elite journeys could be pushed along with great effort, fresh horses, or special priority. But those were exceptions that stand out precisely because they were exceptional. For ordinary long-distance movement, especially with baggage, servants, animals, trade goods, or family members, the pace was far more modest. The rhythm was determined by what could be sustained, not by what could be achieved once on a very good day. Wet ground could turn an acceptable road into a struggle. Wheels sank, hooves slipped, bridges bottlenecked traffic. A river that seemed manageable in 1 week could become dangerous in the next. Even where transport technology improved over time, the physical world kept the upper hand. And this is where the subject becomes more interesting than a simple story of inconvenience. Travel in the Middle Ages was not just a matter of going from one place to another. It revealed the entire structure of society. Who could ride, who had to walk, who could afford pack animals, who could pay tolls, who had access to safer lodging, who traveled in groups, who had legal protection, and who disappeared into the landscape without leaving much record at all. The difficulty of movement was unevenly distributed. A king's envoy, a wealthy merchant, a bishop, a soldier, and a poor pilgrim were all moving through the same broad world, but not through the same experience of it. That difference began with the body itself. For many travelers, especially the poor, travel meant walking, not strolling through picturesque countryside, but day after day of controlled physical attrition. Shoes wore out, clothing absorbed rain, feet blistered, food had to be carried, bought, begged for, or found. A journey was not only measured in miles, but in soreness, hunger, and the quiet uncertainty of where one would sleep. Riding a horse sounds, to modern ears, like an obvious improvement, and of course in some respects it was. But horses were expensive to own, costly to feed, vulnerable to injury, and limited by terrain and fatigue. Riding also did not eliminate discomfort. simply changed its form. Long days in the saddle meant chafing, stiffness, exposure, and constant concern for the animal that made the journey possible. A horse that failed was not an inconvenience in the modern sense. Could collapse the entire plan. And even when the road itself behaved, medieval travelers faced a second reality that is easy to underestimate. Dirt was not incidental. It was part of the system. Mud did not merely make things untidy. It changed the speed of carts, the safety of descents, the effort required from animals, and the likelihood that a traveler would arrive where they intended by nightfall. In a pre-modern world, there was no reliable boundary between the traveler and the environment. You wore the road on your clothes, on your boots, on your baggage, and sometimes in your food and bedding as well. A respectable arrival could quickly become a stained, exhausted one. The romance of journeying looked different when roads became adhesive, when rain entered your cloak faster than body heat could drive it out, and when a day's destination remained several muddy miles away. The very material of travel was against you. This is one reason waterways mattered so much. Medieval people were not foolishly attached to roads when better alternatives existed. Heavy and bulky goods were often moved by water whenever possible, because water transport could carry more with less friction and lower cost than overland hauling. Rivers, coasts, and navigable stretches of water were therefore not just background features on a map. They were, in many cases, the more rational routes. Some towns prospered because they sat near navigable water rather than on ideal roads. That alone tells us something important. Medieval people understood perfectly well that land travel was hard. Whenever geography offered a serious alternative, they often took it, but water had its own limits. Seasonal conditions, mills and weirs, storms, local control, access points, and the simple problem that rivers do not always go where people need them to go. So the road remained unavoidable, even when it was plainly the worse option. For pilgrims, this difficulty carried an added irony. Pilgrimage is often remembered as spiritually elevated, and of course it could be. Medieval Christianity placed enormous value on journeys to holy sites, and major destinations drew travelers from across Europe. But the sacred meaning of pilgrimage did not cancel the practical brutality of getting there. To go on pilgrimage was to submit oneself to roads, hostels, weather, disease, strangers, and uncertainty, all in the name of devotion, penance, hope, gratitude, or desperation. Some pilgrims traveled because they had vowed to do so after illness. Some went to seek healing. Some went because a court imposed pilgrimage as a form of penance. Some went because the act of leaving ordinary life behind had religious weight in itself. The journey, then, was not merely the route to holiness. It was part of the trial. That made its discomfort meaningful but not less real. And yet medieval travel was not only hard because nature made it hard. It was dangerous because human beings made it dangerous too. Roads passed through lordships, forests, contested territories, and places where law was thinner than power. The fear of robbery was not a theatrical embellishment added later by storytellers. It was part of the logic of moving valuable things through spaces where protection could be uncertain. Merchants especially had reason to think in terms of risk. Goods attracted attention. Animals could be stolen. A lone traveler might be vulnerable not only to bandits in the dramatic sense, but to petty extortion, fraudulent tolls, local hostility, or the very ordinary exploitation of someone far from home and unable to appeal effectively to familiar authority. Medieval governments and rulers cared about roads partly because movement was politically and economically important, but the need to protect travelers itself tells us that danger was expected. Still, one of the most revealing truths about the medieval road is that it was dangerous without always being dramatic. Not every threat came with a sword. Sometimes danger was accumulative. A missed bridge crossing, a swollen stream, a lame horse, a bad night in poor lodging, food that was too little or unsafe, a delayed arrival that left someone still outdoors as daylight failed, a fever picked up in a crowded hostel, a road that forked unclearly in bad weather. The modern mind often looks for singular moments of crisis, but many medieval journeys became perilous through subtraction rather than sudden catastrophe. A little warmth lost here, a little time lost there, a little money spent too early, a little strength gone from the animal, and by the end of the week the traveler was in genuine trouble. Lodging, too, was far less straightforward than the word in might suggest. There were urban hostels, religious houses, charitable institutions, private hospitality, and commercial accommodations of varying quality. Some places offered not just shelter but stabling, food, baths, provisions, or guides. Others offered the minimum needed to get through the night. The quality of rest depended heavily on status, location, and luck. A wealthy traveler might secure a decent chamber. A poorer one might sleep in shared conditions, in noise, smell, and crowding that made true recovery difficult. In a world without sanitation in the modern sense, where humans and animals often lived in close practical relation, the line between shelter and discomfort could be very thin. Travel was not simply tiring because of the day's movement. It was tiring because the night often did not restore you properly for the next day. This is also why medieval journeys could feel strangely elastic in time. A distance on parchment was one thing. A distance in lived experience was another. Modern travel gives us the illusion that geography is stable. We ask how far something is, and the answer is usually consistent. In the medieval world, the real answer was often, it depends. It depends on whether the road has held. It depends on whether your animal is sound. It depends on whether local passage is secure. It depends on whether there is daylight enough to make the next settlement. It depends on whether rain has transformed the final stretch into a trap of slick earth. It depends on whether the bridge is standing, whether the ferryman is available, whether your companions can keep pace, whether illness has begun its quiet work in someone's body. Travel time was not simply measured by distance. It was negotiated with circumstance. There is, then, a deeper reason medieval travel seems so much slower to us than it felt to those living inside it. For them, slowness was not always experienced as inefficiency. It was part of how the world worked. Journeys were planned with the expectation of interruption. Delays were not necessarily shocking. Seasonal timing mattered. Local knowledge mattered. The medieval traveler did not usually imagine that the world owed him smoothness. He moved through a landscape of permissions, vulnerabilities, and material resistance. What feels intolerable to us often felt ordinary to them, not because it was easy, but because it was familiar. That does not mean people stayed still. In fact, one of the most useful correctives to modern assumptions is that medieval Europe was far more mobile than the stereotype suggests. Merchants traveled, clergy traveled, students traveled, soldiers traveled, pilgrims traveled, royal officials, messengers, craftsmen, sailors, diplomats, and migrants all moved through this world with varying frequency and purpose. Travel was difficult, but it was also necessary. That is the key to understanding the period. The road was not avoided because it was bad. It was endured because life required it. Trade demanded it. Faith demanded it. Politics demanded it. Ambition demanded it. Survival sometimes demanded it. The hardship of travel did not prevent movement. It shaped the social meaning of movement. And once we understand that, the medieval journey becomes less quaint and more revealing. A road was never just a line between places. It was a test of infrastructure, whether wealth, law, health, hierarchy, and patience. It exposed the difference between official order and actual experience. It showed how fragile comfort could be outside the bounds of home. And perhaps most of all, it reminds us that movement, which feels almost effortless to many of us now, was once a slow negotiation with mud, animal strength, daylight, and luck. In the next part of the journey, the picture grows even more intimate because once a traveler actually set out, every ordinary detail began to matter in ways modern people rarely have to think about at all. What to wear, what to carry, whom to trust, when to stop, and how quickly a routine trip could become a long lesson in discomfort. That question, what to wear, what to carry, whom to trust, was not a minor detail at the edges of the journey. It was the journey, in many ways, reduced to its most practical and revealing form. Clothing, for example, was not simply about modesty or appearance. It was a piece of survival equipment. A traveler needed garments that could endure repetition, friction, and exposure, often for weeks or months at a time. Cloaks were valued not because they looked distinctive, but because they served multiple purposes. Protection from rain, insulation against cold, a blanket at night, and sometimes even a makeshift shelter when no proper lodging could be found. But even a good cloak had limits. Once soaked through, it could become heavy and slow to dry. A long stretch of damp weather could turn clothing from protection into burden. Footwear mattered even more. Shoes were not disposable, and a worn sole could become a serious problem far from any town capable of repair. For those walking long distances, the condition of their feet was as important as the condition of the road. A blister ignored early could become infected. A small injury could force slower movement, which then affected where one could reach before nightfall. The modern separation between minor discomfort and real danger was thinner in a world where delay itself carried risk. What to carry was equally complex. Every item had to justify its weight. Food, when carried, was often simple and durable: bread, dried meat, perhaps cheese. But supplies could not always be trusted to last as long as intended. Travelers might rely on inns, monasteries, or villages for provisions, but that required money, or at least something of value to exchange. Water, too, was not always straightforward. While rivers and streams were common, their safety varied, and travelers had to balance necessity with caution. Money introduced another layer of calculation. Carry too little, and the journey could stall at the first unexpected expense. Carry too much, and one became a more attractive target for theft. Some merchants and officials traveled with letters of credit or arrangements that allowed them to draw funds in different locations, but such systems were limited and depended heavily on networks of trust. For many others, wealth had to be carried physically, often hidden, divided, or guarded in ways that added quiet anxiety to each step of the journey. And then there was the question of companionship. Traveling alone offered flexibility, but it also meant vulnerability. A group provided safety in numbers, shared knowledge, and sometimes shared cost. Pilgrims often traveled together for this reason, forming temporary communities bound by common purpose and mutual dependence. Merchants might join caravans or organized convoys, especially when moving valuable goods. Even strangers could become companions for a stretch of road, their conversation and presence offering both reassurance and practical advantage. But companionship introduced its own uncertainties. Not every fellow traveler was trustworthy. Alliances were often temporary, based on convenience rather than deep knowledge. A group could move only as fast as its slowest member, and disagreements about pace, route, or destination were not uncommon. Trust, in this context, was rarely absolute. It was negotiated, tested, and sometimes broken. Timing, too, shaped every decision. Medieval travelers thought carefully about when to set out and when to stop. Daylight was a finite resource. Without artificial lighting sufficient for safe movement, the road after dark became far more dangerous. Hazards that could be managed in daylight, uneven ground, narrow paths, water crossings, became unpredictable in darkness. There was also the simple human need for rest. Pushing too far in a single day could leave both traveler and animal exhausted, increasing the risk of mistakes on the following day. Seasonal timing mattered just as much. Winter could freeze routes, making some roads more passable but others nearly impossible. Snow obscured paths. Ice made footing treacherous. Summer brought its own challenges. Heat, dust, and the strain placed on both people and animals over long distances. Spring and autumn, with their rains, could transform already imperfect roads into stretches of thick, clinging mud that slowed movement to a crawl. A journey that might be manageable in one season could become impractical in another, and experienced travelers planned accordingly. Even with careful planning, uncertainty remained constant. A traveler might set out with a clear intention to reach a market town, a shrine, a court, or a distant city, but along the way, that intention had to be continually adjusted. A bridge might be out, a ferry might not be operating, a route might be blocked by local conflict. News traveled along the same roads as people, and information picked up at one stop could alter the next decision entirely. This flow of information is another detail that reveals something deeper about medieval travel. Roads were not only physical pathways, they were channels through which knowledge moved. Travelers carried stories, warnings, prices, rumors, and news of events far beyond the horizon. An inn was not just a place to sleep, it was a place to listen. Who had passed through recently? Was the road ahead safe? Had there been trouble in a nearby region? Was a certain bridge reliable or best avoided? The answers to these questions could shape the journey more than any map. And maps themselves, in the modern sense, were not always available or relied upon. Many travelers navigated through memory, local guidance, and shared knowledge. Directions were often described in terms of landmarks, rivers, hills, churches, crossroads, rather than precise measurements. A wrong turn was not merely inconvenient. It could lead to hours or days of lost time, especially in unfamiliar territory. All of this meant that travel required a kind of quiet attentiveness that is easy to overlook today. The traveler had to read the environment continuously. The condition of the road, the behavior of animals, the look of the sky, the sound of water, the presence or absence of other travelers. Each of these could offer clues about what lay ahead. Experience mattered, but so did adaptability. Even a seasoned traveler could be surprised. There is also a subtle but important psychological dimension to all of this. Travel, especially over long distances, involved a sustained awareness of risk that never fully disappeared. Not constant fear, but a background tension. A recognition that comfort was temporary, that plans were provisional, and that the margin for error was often narrow. This did not necessarily make travel unbearable. For some, it may even have made it meaningful, sharpening the sense of movement and achievement. But it did mean that every mile carried a weight that is difficult to reproduce in a world where movement is largely predictable. And yet, despite all these challenges, people continued to move. That persistence tells us something essential. Medieval travel was not simply endured. It was integrated into life. Systems developed around it. Routes became known. Certain inns gained reputations. Religious houses offered hospitality. Markets depended on the arrival of goods. Political authority extended itself along roads, however imperfectly. The difficulty of travel did not stop the network from existing. It defined how that network functioned. But perhaps the most revealing detail comes when we look closely at the smallest, most ordinary moment of a journey. The decision to stop for the night. That choice, simple on the surface, brought together nearly every factor we've been considering. Distance covered, daylight remaining, physical condition, availability of shelter, safety of the surrounding area, presence of other travelers, cost of lodging, condition of animals. all had to be weighed, often quickly. Stop too early, and the journey lengthened unnecessarily, increasing costs and exposure over time. Stop too late, and one risked arriving in darkness, when options were fewer and dangers greater. A traveler approaching a town near dusk might feel both relief and urgency, hoping that space was available, that the cost would be manageable, and that the night would offer real rest rather than just temporary shelter. And it is in these moments, repeated night after night, that the reality of medieval travel becomes most clear. Not in the grand departure, not in the distant destination, but in the accumulation of decisions made under constraint. Each evening carried its own small uncertainty, its own negotiation with the limits of the body and the world. Because the journey was never just about reaching somewhere. It was about maintaining the ability to continue. And as we move further into this world, the next layer becomes even more revealing, because beyond the road, beyond the clothing and the supplies, beyond the rhythm of days and nights, there was another force shaping every journey in ways both visible and hidden. The legal and social systems that governed who could move freely, who could be stopped, and what it really meant to travel through lands that were never entirely neutral ground. The idea that land could ever be neutral was, in the medieval world, more illusion than reality. Every road passed through jurisdictions, sometimes clearly defined, sometimes overlapping, and often contested. A traveler was not simply moving across distance, but passing through layers of authority, each with its own expectations, protections, and risks. In theory, rulers understood the importance of movement. Kings issued charters promising safe passage. Certain routes were designated as highways, and interfering with travelers on them could be treated as a serious offense. Pilgrims, in particular, were often granted a form of recognized protection, their journey framed as religiously legitimate and, in some cases, legally safeguarded. Merchants, too, were essential to economic life, and there were incentives for authorities to ensure that trade routes remained viable. But the existence of law did not guarantee its consistent application. Medieval power was uneven. A royal decree might carry authority in principle, yet be weak in practice in regions where local lords held stronger, more immediate control. A traveler could move from one territory where protection was relatively reliable into another where it depended entirely on the disposition of a local authority or the strength of a nearby garrison. This created a subtle but constant recalculation. A journey was not just plotted in miles, but in political geography. Travelers learned to recognize which regions were stable, which were prone to disputes, and which required caution. Reputation mattered. Some roads were known to be safer, not because they were physically better, but because they were more closely watched or more frequently used by those with influence. Tolls offer a particularly clear example of how authority shaped the experience of travel. At bridges, gates, river crossings, and entry points to towns, travelers were often required to pay for passage. These tolls were not necessarily arbitrary. They could fund maintenance, support local governance, or reflect long-standing rights granted to a lord or institution. But from the traveler's perspective, they introduced friction. Each stop required negotiation, payment, or proof of exemption. And exemptions themselves tell us something important. Certain groups, clergy, officials, sometimes merchants under specific agreements, might carry documents granting them reduced fees or passage without charge. These documents were more than administrative details. They were portable expressions of status. To carry one was to move differently through the world, to encounter fewer obstacles, or at least to have a recognized argument when obstacles appeared. For those without such privileges, the experience could be less predictable. A toll might be higher than expected. A demand might be made without clear justification. A local official might interpret rights in a way that favored his own interests. In such situations, the traveler's options were limited. To argue required confidence, knowledge, and sometimes backing. To refuse could mean delay or confrontation. Often, the practical choice was to pay and continue, absorbing the cost as part of the journey. Yet even here, there is a deeper layer beneath the inconvenience. Tolls and controls were not only about extracting revenue. They were about visibility. Movement in the medieval world was, in many contexts, something to be noticed, recorded, and sometimes questioned. A stranger passing through a region was not anonymous in the modern sense. Their presence could be remarked upon, their purpose considered, their identity inferred or challenged. This becomes especially clear when we consider documents of passage. While not universally required in all regions at all times, letters of introduction, safe conducts, and similar forms of identification played a growing role in certain contexts. A traveler carrying such a document could present it as proof of purpose, affiliation, or protection. It might be issued by a ruler, a religious authority, or a powerful patron. But again, the existence of documentation did not remove uncertainty. A document had to be recognized to be effective. Its authority depended on the willingness of others to accept it. A traveler might present a carefully obtained letter only to find that it carried little weight in a distant region where local concerns took precedence over distant endorsements. This interplay between formal authority and local reality is one of the quiet tensions that shaped medieval travel. On one level, there was a growing sense of order, routes, laws, protections, institutions. On another, there was the persistent variability of lived experience. The same journey, taken by two different people or even by the same person at different times, could unfold in very different ways depending on how these layers aligned. There is also a more personal dimension to this. Identity mattered in ways that could not always be concealed. Language, accent, clothing, manner, even the way a person carried themselves, all could signal origin, status, or unfamiliarity. In a small village or along a less traveled road, a stranger could be immediately noticeable. This visibility could bring help, curiosity, or suspicion. For some travelers, especially those of lower status or without clear affiliation, this could be a source of vulnerability. Being unable to explain oneself convincingly, or lacking a recognized purpose, could lead to delays or exclusion. In extreme cases, it could lead to being turned away or treated as a potential threat. Medieval communities were not closed in a strict sense. Movement was too common for that, but they were attentive to who passed through them and why. At the same time, hospitality existed as a counterbalance to this caution. Religious teachings, social expectations, and practical interdependence all encouraged some degree of welcome to travelers. Monasteries, in particular, often maintained traditions of offering shelter and food, especially to pilgrims. In more informal settings, individuals might offer assistance, directions, or temporary lodging. But hospitality was not uniform. It varied by region, by institution, by circumstance, and by the traveler's perceived identity. A well-dressed merchant might receive a different reception than a solitary, poorly equipped wanderer. A known pilgrim route might offer more consistent support than a less frequented path. Again, the experience was shaped by a combination of factors rather than a single rule. All of this contributed to a sense that travel was not only a physical journey, but a social negotiation. Each encounter at a toll gate, in a village, at an inn, on the road itself, required a degree of awareness and adaptability. A traveler had to present themselves in a way that made sense within the expectations of those they met, while also protecting their own interests. And yet, despite these constraints, movement continued to bind the medieval world together in ways that are easy to underestimate. Roads carried not only goods and people, but also ideas, customs, technologies, and beliefs. A merchant might introduce new products to a distant market. A pilgrim might carry stories from one shrine to another. A scholar might travel between centers of learning, bringing knowledge that reshaped intellectual life. Travel was difficult, but it was also connective. This creates an interesting contrast with the common image of the Middle Ages as isolated or static. In reality, while communication was slower and more fragile than in the modern world, it was not absent. It moved along these same challenging routes, shaped by the same limitations, but still capable of reaching surprising distances over time. And sometimes, it is in the tension between movement and restriction that we see the most revealing details. Because not everyone who traveled did so entirely by choice. There were those sent on journeys by obligation, messengers carrying orders, soldiers marching under command, officials enforcing authority. There were those moving under pressure, refugees fleeing conflict, individuals expelled from communities, people seeking opportunities unavailable at home. For these travelers, the road was not an option among many. It was a necessity shaped by forces beyond their control. Their experience of travel could be more urgent, more precarious, and less forgiving. A delay was not just inconvenient, could be dangerous. A lack of resources was not just uncomfortable, could be decisive. And it is here, at the intersection of law, necessity, and vulnerability, that the medieval journey reveals another layer of its character. Because the road did not treat all travelers equally, and the same systems that facilitated movement for some could restrict or complicate it for others. Which raises a quieter but more difficult question, one that begins to shift the focus from how people traveled to why they sometimes had no real choice but to keep moving, even when the road itself offered no guarantee of safety, comfort, or return. That question, why someone would continue forward despite the uncertainty, the discomfort, and the real possibility of loss, begins to make more sense when we look at the pressures that made stillness, in some cases even more difficult than movement. For many medieval people, remaining in one place was not always a stable or secure option. Land was tied to obligation. Villages were bound by systems of labor, taxation, and local authority that could become restrictive or even unbearable under certain conditions. A poor harvest, rising dues, conflict between lords, or simple lack of opportunity could gradually narrow the space in which a person could live with any degree of stability. In those moments, the road, however uncertain, could represent not freedom in the modern sense, but a form of necessary adjustment. Seasonal labor offers one of the clearest examples. Agricultural cycles did not always provide sufficient work throughout the year, and in some regions, individuals moved in search of temporary employment, harvesting, construction, or service in larger towns. These were not grand journeys, but they were repeated, practical movements shaped by economic need. The traveler in this case was not seeking adventure or transformation, but continuity, enough work to sustain life through the next season. There were also those drawn by the quiet promise of towns and cities. Urban centers, though far from comfortable by modern standards, offered possibilities that rural life did not always provide. Trade, craft, apprenticeship, and, in some cases, a degree of personal independence. The idea that town air makes free, though more complex in practice than in theory, reflected a real perception that movement toward certain places could alter one's circumstances. But reaching those places required enduring the road first, with all its uncertainties intact. Conflict, too, played its role. While large-scale wars are often remembered through battles and rulers, their effects on ordinary people were frequently expressed through movement. Villages could be abandoned temporarily or permanently. Families might leave areas of instability in search of safer ground. Soldiers themselves, whether professional or conscripted, experienced the road as part of their daily existence, marching across regions that were often as difficult to traverse as they were to defend. And then there were those whose movement was shaped by law in a more direct sense. Exile, for example, was not uncommon as a form of punishment. To be expelled from a community was to be placed on the road without the protections and familiarity of home. The journey that followed was not chosen, but imposed. Its difficulty was part of its meaning. Even outside formal punishment, legal and social pressures could push individuals into motion. Disputes, debts, accusations, or changes in local authority might make it difficult to remain where one was known. In such cases, the road became a space of transition, not necessarily towards something better, but away from something no longer sustainable. This helps explain a subtle but important feature of medieval travel. It was often reactive rather than planned in the modern sense. While merchants and officials might organize journeys with clear objectives, many others traveled because circumstances required it. The decision to move was not always about destination, but about necessity. And necessity, in this context, did not remove uncertainty. It intensified it. A traveler moving under pressure had less flexibility. There was less margin for delay, less capacity to absorb unexpected costs, and often fewer resources to manage risk. A missed opportunity or an unforeseen obstacle could have consequences that extended beyond the journey itself, affecting the traveler's ability to settle, work, or integrate into a new place. This is where the emotional texture of medieval travel becomes more visible. It was not only a physical experience, but a psychological one shaped by anticipation, concern, and, at times, quiet hope. The road carried the possibility of change, but also the weight of what had been left behind. A traveler might move toward opportunity while carrying uncertainty about whether that opportunity would materialize at all. And yet, even in these more difficult circumstances, the structures we have been discussing, roads, inns, tolls, systems of authority, patterns of hospitality, continued to frame the journey. A person fleeing a difficult situation still had to navigate the same physical and social landscape as a merchant or a pilgrim. The difference lay not in the road itself, but in how much control the traveler had over their movement within it. There is also a quiet continuity between these different kinds of travelers that is easy to overlook. Whether moving by choice or by necessity, each person became part of the same broader flow. Roads connected not only places, but experiences. A merchant might share a road with a pilgrim, a laborer, a soldier, and a displaced family, each with different reasons for being there, yet all subject to the same conditions of movement. This shared experience contributed to a kind of informal knowledge network. Information about routes, dangers, opportunities, and conditions did not remain confined to a single group. It circulated. A warning given by one traveler might shape the decisions of another. A reputation for safety or danger could spread along a route, influencing movement in ways that were not centrally controlled. In this sense, the medieval road was not just a physical infrastructure. It was a social environment shaped by the accumulation of individual journeys. Each traveler added to it, not in a visible, permanent way, but through the passing of information, the reinforcement of routes, and the gradual establishment of expectations. And those expectations, once formed, could be surprisingly resilient. A particular inn might become known as reliable. A certain crossing might be avoided in bad weather. A stretch of road might gain a reputation for difficulty or danger that persisted even as conditions changed. Over time, these patterns created a kind of lived geography, one that existed alongside, and sometimes more powerfully than any formal description of the landscape. But there is another dimension to this that becomes clearer the longer we stay with it. Because while the road connected people, it also exposed them to one of the most persistent and least controllable aspects of medieval life: disease. Movement, by its nature, brought individuals into contact with new environments, new communities, and new conditions of hygiene. Inns, hostels, and shared sleeping spaces, while essential for travel, also created opportunities for illness to spread. A traveler might carry a sickness from one place to another without knowing it, or encounter illness in a location far from home, without the support networks that might otherwise help them recover. This was not always dramatic. Much of it would have been experienced as ordinary sickness, fevers, infections, exhaustion. But in a world without modern medicine, even relatively common illnesses could become serious, especially when combined with the physical strain of travel. And occasionally, the connection between movement and disease became more visible on a larger scale. Epidemics could follow routes of trade and travel, moving along the same networks that carried goods and people. The road, in this sense, was not only a pathway of connection, but also a pathway of vulnerability. For the individual traveler, this added another layer of uncertainty. Health was not something that could be assumed. It had to be maintained, protected, and sometimes simply endured. A person might begin a journey in good condition and find themselves weakened days or weeks later, their ability to continue shaped not by the road alone, but by their own physical limits. And this brings us back, in a quieter way, to the central reality of medieval travel. It was not defined by a single difficulty, whether slowness, dirt, or danger, but by the way these elements combined, often unpredictably, to shape each journey in its own particular way. Because once a traveler stepped onto the road, they were no longer moving through a controlled environment. They were moving through a world that responded to them, sometimes gently, sometimes harshly, and often without warning. And it is at this point, when we begin to see how many variables were constantly in motion, that another question begins to take shape, one that shifts our attention from the traveler to the landscape itself, and to the ways in which geography, climate, and terrain quietly dictated not just how people moved, but whether they could move at all. That question, whether people could move at all, becomes clearer when we begin to look closely at the land itself, not as a passive backdrop, but as an active force shaping every decision a traveler made. Medieval geography was not simply a matter of distance between two points. It was a pattern of constraints. Rivers, hills, forests, marshes, and open plains each imposed their own conditions, and none of them behaved in a perfectly stable or predictable way. A route that seemed straightforward on a dry day could become nearly impassable after rain. A forest path that offered shade and direction could also obscure danger or mislead the unfamiliar. A valley might guide movement naturally, but also funnel travelers into narrow passages where options were limited. Rivers, in particular, illustrate this dual nature of geography. On one hand, they were lifelines, avenues for transport, sources of water, markers of direction. On the other, they were barriers. Crossing a river was not always a simple matter of finding a bridge. Bridges existed, but they were relatively few, often concentrated near towns, and sometimes in poor condition. Elsewhere, travelers relied on ferries, fords, or makeshift solutions that depended heavily on local knowledge. And even when a crossing was known, it could not always be trusted. Water levels changed, currents shifted. A ford that was safe one week might be dangerous the next. Ferries might not be operating, or might demand a fee that a traveler could not easily afford. A delay at a river crossing was not merely inconvenient. It could disrupt the entire rhythm of a journey, forcing a traveler to reconsider where they would stop, how far they could go, and whether they had the resources to wait. Forests carried their own kind of uncertainty. To a modern eye, a forest might seem like a peaceful, enclosed space, but for medieval travelers, it was often something more ambiguous. It could provide cover, shelter, and resources, but it could also conceal hazards, uneven ground, hidden water, or people whose intentions were unclear. Paths through forests were not always clearly marked, and losing one's way could mean hours of retracing steps, or worse, moving deeper into unfamiliar terrain. At the same time, forests were not empty. They were used, managed, and sometimes restricted. Royal forests, for example, were governed by specific laws that controlled hunting and access. Traveling through such areas could involve additional considerations, whether one had the right to be there, whether one might be challenged, and how to navigate a space that was both natural and legally defined. Hills and mountains introduced another layer of complexity. Elevation changed everything. A road that climbed gradually might still exhaust both traveler and animal over time. Steeper paths required careful navigation, especially with carts or pack animals. Weather at higher elevations could shift more quickly, bringing cold, wind, or reduced visibility. In some regions, mountain passes became critical routes, used repeatedly despite their difficulty because alternatives were even less practical. These passes were often narrow and exposed, with limited room for error. A misstep, a sudden change in weather, or a weakened animal could have serious consequences. Yet they were also essential linking regions that would otherwise remain isolated. Travelers who used them developed a particular kind of awareness, reading the terrain closely, judging conditions, and sometimes waiting for the right moment to attempt the crossing. Marshes and wetlands, though less dramatic, could be equally challenging. They blurred the boundary between solid ground and water, creating surfaces that appeared stable but were not. Paths through such areas were often narrow and required precise knowledge. A deviation of only a few steps could lead to sinking ground or impassable mud. In these environments, local guidance was especially valuable, and travelers unfamiliar with the terrain faced a heightened risk of delay or danger. Even open land, which might seem the simplest to traverse, carried its own difficulties. Without clear landmarks, direction could become uncertain. Exposure to wind, sun, or rain was more direct, and while visibility was greater, so too was the sense of isolation. A traveler crossing a wide plain might see their destination in the distance, yet find that reaching it took far longer than expected, the scale of the landscape stretching time as well as space. All of these elements interacted with one another. A journey rarely involved only one type of terrain. A traveler might begin in open farmland, move into forest, cross a river, climb a series of hills, and descend into a marshy valley, all within the span of a few days. Each transition required adjustment of pace, of expectation, of physical effort. And then there was the weather, which did not simply overlay the landscape, but transformed it. Rain, perhaps the most common and persistent factor, altered nearly every aspect of travel. It softened roads, deepened ruts, and increased the weight of everything a traveler carried. It reduced visibility, making navigation more difficult. It affected the behavior of animals, the stability of slopes, and the safety of crossings. A steady rain over several days could turn a manageable journey into a slow, exhausting progression through mud and uncertainty. Wind, too, played a role, especially in more exposed regions. It could chill the body, increase fatigue, and make certain routes more difficult to follow. In combination with rain or cold, it could contribute to conditions that wore down even experienced travelers over time. Temperature, though less immediately disruptive than rain, shaped the broader structure of travel. Cold conditions required more preparation, more protection, and often more time. Heat demanded careful pacing, especially for those walking or managing animals. Extremes in either direction could limit how far a traveler could go in a single day. Seasonal patterns brought all of these factors together. A route that was known and reliable in summer might become uncertain in autumn, difficult in spring, and nearly impossible in winter. Experienced travelers did not simply choose a route. They chose a moment. Timing could determine not just comfort, but feasibility. And yet, despite all of this, there is a quiet consistency in how medieval travelers approached the landscape. They did not expect to overcome it in the modern sense. They worked with it. They adapted their routes, their schedules, and their expectations to its rhythms. Knowledge of terrain was not abstract. It was practical, accumulated through experience, shared through conversation, and tested with each journey. This practical knowledge often mattered more than any formal description. A traveler who knew where a road tended to flood, where a path became difficult after rain, or where a reliable crossing could be found held an advantage that could not easily be replaced. In this sense, geography was not just a physical reality. It was a body of knowledge, unevenly distributed and highly valued. And this brings us to a quieter, but perhaps more revealing point. The difficulty of medieval travel was not simply a matter of obstacles. It was a matter of constant negotiation with a world that did not behave consistently. A traveler could not assume that yesterday's conditions would hold today, or that a known route would remain unchanged. Flexibility was not optional. It was essential, which means that every journey, no matter how familiar the route, carried with it a degree of unpredictability that modern travel has largely eliminated. Even a well-known road could present new challenges, and even an experienced traveler could find themselves adjusting plans in response to changes that were beyond their control. And it is within this shifting, responsive landscape that we begin to see why medieval travel felt not only slower, but heavier. Each mile required attention, effort, and sometimes compromise. Progress was rarely smooth. It was earned, step by step, through conditions that demanded respect rather than speed. And as we continue forward, another layer begins to emerge. One that moves from the external world of roads and terrain into the more intimate reality of the human body itself, and the quiet limits it imposed on every journey, no matter how carefully planned. And once we turn toward the human body itself, the journey becomes even more intimate, because the final boundary that every medieval traveler encountered was not the road, or the law, or the weather, but their own physical limits. Endurance in this world was not an abstract quality. It was measured daily, quietly, and often without ceremony. A traveler woke not fully restored, but partially recovered. Muscles remained sore. Feet retained the memory of the previous day's strain. Sleep, especially in shared or uncomfortable spaces, rarely provided complete relief. So each morning began not at zero, but somewhere in the middle of fatigue, and the question was not how far one could go in ideal conditions, but how much more could be asked of a body already in use. Walking, which for many was the default form of travel, imposed a steady, cumulative demand. The rhythm of steps, repeated over miles, over days, over weeks, created a kind of slow erosion. There was no single moment when exhaustion arrived. It built gradually, sometimes unnoticed until it began to affect judgment, pace, or balance. A traveler might find themselves slowing without intending to, or needing more frequent pauses, or arriving later than expected with less strength remaining for the next day. For those riding, the experience was different, but not necessarily easier. Riding transferred the burden from feet to the rest of the body. Long hours in the saddle placed strain on the back, hips, and legs. The constant motion required adjustment, balance, and attention, and there was always the need to care for the animal, feeding, watering, resting, because the traveler's capacity to continue depended directly on the condition of the horse or mule beneath them. Fatigue, in this sense, was shared. Animals tired. They slowed, stumbled, or showed signs of strain that had to be recognized and respected. A traveler who ignored these signs risked more than inconvenience. An exhausted or injured animal could halt progress entirely. In some cases, it could leave the traveler stranded, forced to continue on foot or to seek help in a place where help might not be readily available. Food and nourishment played a quiet but central role in this balance. Medieval diets, especially on the road, were not always sufficient to sustain prolonged physical effort. A traveler might eat regularly but not optimally. Meals could be irregular in timing, limited in variety, and dependent on what was available rather than what was needed. Over time, this could contribute to a gradual weakening that was difficult to notice in a single day, but significant over the course of a long journey. Hydration, too, was uneven. Access to water varied by region and route. While streams and rivers were common, their safety could not always be assumed. Travelers had to judge when and where to drink, balancing need with caution. Dehydration, though not always recognized in the modern sense, would have affected stamina, clarity of thought, and overall resilience. And then there was illness, which did not always arrive dramatically, but often quietly. A slight fever, a persistent cough, a wound that failed to heal cleanly. In a settled environment, these might be manageable. On the road, they became more complicated. Rest was limited. Care was inconsistent. Exposure continued. A minor condition could deepen, and a traveler had to decide whether to press on, to stop, or to seek assistance that might not be easily found. This introduces a subtle but important tension in medieval travel. Progress required movement, but recovery required stillness. The two were often in conflict. To stop for too long could deplete resources or delay arrival beyond what was practical. To continue without sufficient rest could worsen fatigue or illness, reducing the ability to complete the journey at all. So travelers learned, consciously or not, to manage this balance. They adjusted pace. They chose when to rest and when to push forward. They listened to their bodies, not in a reflective or analytical way, but in a practical one, responding to signs of strain, discomfort, or weakness with decisions that affected the next stage of the journey. Pain, in this context, was not always something to be eliminated. It was something to be interpreted. A certain level of discomfort was expected. The challenge was to recognize when it crossed into something more serious, when a sore foot became an injury, when fatigue became dangerous, when a minor illness began to interfere with the ability to travel safely. There is also an emotional dimension to this physical experience that is easy to overlook. Long journeys, especially those undertaken alone or under difficult circumstances, created periods of extended isolation. Even when traveling with others, there were stretches of quiet, of repetitive movement, of inward attention. The mind, like the body, had to endure. For some, this may have been a space of reflection, even of calm. For others, it may have been marked by worry, by the steady awareness of risk, or by the simple monotony of the road. The psychological experience of travel was shaped by purpose, by company, and by circumstance, but it was always present, accompanying the physical act of movement. And yet, despite all these constraints, the body was not only a limit. It was also a tool, adaptable, resilient, capable of more than might be expected under difficult conditions. Medieval travelers developed a kind of practical endurance, shaped not by training in the modern sense, but by necessity and repetition. They learned what their bodies could sustain, how to pace themselves, and how to recover within the limits available to them. This resilience, however, was not uniform. It varied by age, by health, by experience, and by circumstance. A young, experienced traveler might move with relative efficiency. An older or less experienced individual might struggle more, requiring additional time, support, or adjustment. Again, the same road could produce very different experiences depending on who walked it. And it is here that we begin to see another quiet reality of medieval travel. It was not designed for comfort, and it did not adapt itself to the traveler. The traveler had to adapt to it. There were no systems in place to smooth every difficulty, no consistent mechanisms to ensure rest, nourishment, or safety. What existed instead was a combination of individual preparation, shared knowledge, and the variable support of the environments through which one passed. This meant that every journey carried a degree of personal responsibility that is difficult to replicate in a more structured world. Success depended not only on external conditions, but on the traveler's ability to respond to them, to manage their body, their resources, and their decisions in a way that allowed them to continue. And continue they did, often under conditions that would feel, to a modern observer, quietly overwhelming. Not through dramatic acts of endurance, but through steady, repeated effort, one day following another, one decision leading to the next. Which brings us, almost naturally, to a final layer of this experience. Not an ending, but a deeper refinement of the question we have been following all along. Because if the road was difficult, the landscape unpredictable, the law uneven, and the body limited, then what determined whether a journey ultimately succeeded or failed was often something less visible, but just as important. The accumulation of small choices made along the way, and how those choices interacted with a world that never fully stood still. Those small choices, when to stop, when to continue, what to carry, whom to trust, rarely felt dramatic in the moment, but over the course of a long journey, they accumulated into something that could quietly determine the outcome. A traveler deciding whether to push on for another mile before dusk might believe they were making a simple calculation about distance. But that extra mile could mean arriving in darkness, missing a safe place to rest, or encountering a stretch of road that was harder to navigate without light. The same decision, made differently, might mean stopping earlier, accepting a less ideal lodging, but preserving strength for the next day. Neither choice was obviously right or wrong. Each carried its own consequences, and those consequences often unfolded slowly. This is what made medieval travel feel, in many ways, like a continuous negotiation rather than a fixed plan. There was no clear separation between preparation and execution. The journey was constantly being revised, not on paper, but in response to conditions that shifted from hour to hour. Even something as ordinary as choosing a route could involve layers of uncertainty. A more direct path might promise speed, but pass through less secure territory or more difficult terrain. A longer route might offer better roads, more reliable stopping points, or safer passage, but at the cost of time and resources. Travelers weighed these options not once, but repeatedly as new information became available. Information itself, as we have seen, was rarely complete. A warning about a dangerous stretch of road might be accurate, or it might reflect conditions that had already changed. A recommendation for a good inn might be based on someone else's experience, shaped by their status, expectations, or timing. Each piece of advice had to be interpreted, filtered through the traveler's own circumstances. And interpretation required judgment, which was not always consistent. Fatigue, hunger, and stress could affect how decisions were made. A traveler nearing the end of a long day might take risks they would have avoided in the morning. A person under pressure to reach a destination quickly might choose speed over safety, even when the balance suggested caution. This introduces a subtle unpredictability into the medieval journey. It was not only the external world that was variable. The traveler themselves was variable, responding to changing internal conditions as much as to the landscape. There is also an interesting tension between planning and improvisation. Some journeys were carefully prepared. Merchants might calculate distances, estimate costs, and arrange for goods and animals in advance. Officials might travel with escorts, documents, and defined routes. Pilgrims might follow established paths, guided by tradition and shared knowledge. But even the best prepared journey could not eliminate the need for improvisation. Plans were frameworks, not guarantees. They provided direction, but not certainty. The real work of travel happened in the adjustments made along the way. And those adjustments often depended on relationships, temporary, informal, and sometimes fragile. A traveler might rely on a stranger for directions, on a host for shelter, on a ferryman for passage, on a group for safety along a dangerous stretch. Each of these interactions required a degree of trust, and trust, in this context, was often built quickly and with limited information. This is where reputation and behavior became important. A traveler who presented themselves respectfully, who understood local customs, and who navigated social expectations effectively could move more smoothly through different environments. Missteps, whether through misunderstanding, impatience, or simple misjudgment, could create friction that slowed or complicated the journey. Language, too, played a role. In regions where dialects varied, communication could become uncertain. A request might be misunderstood. Instructions might be unclear. Even small misunderstandings could lead to larger problems if they affected direction, timing, or expectations. Yet, despite these challenges, there is a quiet pattern that emerges. Medieval travel was sustained not only by individual effort, but by a network of small, often unrecorded acts of cooperation. A villager offering guidance, a host providing a meal, a fellow traveler sharing news of the road ahead. These moments did not eliminate difficulty, but they made movement possible in a world where formal systems were incomplete. At the same time, these acts were not guaranteed. They depended on context, on perception, and on the traveler's ability to navigate social space as well as physical space. The same road could feel supportive or isolating depending on how these interactions unfolded. There is also a deeper layer to this pattern, one that becomes clearer when we consider how travelers remembered and described their journeys. Surviving accounts, where they exist, often focus not only on distances or destinations, but on experiences, difficult crossings, unexpected delays, acts of kindness, moments of danger. What stands out is not a smooth progression, but a sequence of encounters and adjustments. This suggests that medieval travel was experienced less as a continuous line and more as a series of episodes. Each day, each stretch of road, each stop along the way formed its own small narrative, connected to the larger journey but distinct in its details. And within these episodes, the accumulation of small choices becomes more visible. A decision made in one moment could shape the next several days. Choosing to follow a certain group might lead to safer passage or to delays. Accepting hospitality in one place might provide rest or expose the traveler to illness. Taking a shortcut might save time or create new difficulties. What makes this particularly interesting is that the outcome of these choices was not always immediately clear. A decision that seemed advantageous at first might reveal its cost later. A cautious choice that slowed progress might ultimately prevent a more serious problem. In this way, medieval travel involved a kind of delayed understanding. Travelers learned from experience, but that experience unfolded over time, often with consequences that could not be fully anticipated. And yet, despite this uncertainty, patterns did emerge. Regular routes became more predictable. Seasonal rhythms were understood. Certain practices, traveling in groups, avoiding travel at night, seeking known stopping points, became established not because they were perfect solutions, but because they worked often enough to be trusted. This gradual shaping of practice is another reminder that medieval travel was not chaotic, even if it was uncertain. It was structured by experience, by shared knowledge, and by the slow accumulation of what had proven effective. But there is still one more dimension to consider, because even with experience, preparation, and careful decision-making, travelers were never entirely in control of their journeys. There were moments when the balance shifted suddenly, when a road became impassable, when a region became unstable, when an illness took hold, or when an encounter changed the course of travel in ways that could not be predicted. And it is in these moments, when control slipped and the journey took on a life of its own, that we begin to see most clearly why medieval travel was not just slower and dirtier, but fundamentally more fragile than we tend to imagine. A fragility that could turn an ordinary journey into something far more uncertain with very little warning at all. That fragility, the sense that a journey could quietly shift beyond the traveler's control, was not always the result of dramatic events. More often, it emerged through a subtle accumulation of small disruptions that, taken together, altered the direction or outcome of the entire experience. A cart axle might crack on uneven ground, not with a violent break, but with a gradual weakening that finally gave way under weight. A horse might develop a slight limp that worsened over the course of a day, forcing a reduction in pace that could not be recovered. A river crossing might be delayed just long enough to push the next stage of the journey into darkness. Each of these moments on its own might seem manageable, but in combination, they created a kind of slow unraveling, where the original plan no longer aligned with reality. This is where the concept of contingency becomes central. Medieval travel depended not on a single path to success, but on the ability to adjust when that path became unavailable. A traveler needed alternatives, different routes, different stopping points, different ways of continuing when the expected method failed. But alternatives were not always clearly defined. A secondary route might be less known, less safe, or more difficult. A different inn might be farther away or already full. Hiring a replacement animal might be possible in one region and impossible in another. Each adjustment introduced new uncertainties, and the traveler had to weigh them quickly, often with incomplete information. There is also a quiet economic dimension to these moments. Every delay, every detour, every repair carried a cost. For a well-resourced traveler, these costs might be absorbed, though not without concern. For someone with limited means, they could become critical. A journey planned with narrow margins left little room for unexpected expense. Money spent on repairs or extended lodging could reduce the ability to pay for food, tolls, or future accommodation. This created a kind of pressure that was both practical and psychological. Decisions were not only about safety or efficiency, but about sustainability. Could the traveler afford to wait? Could they afford to take a longer route? Could they afford to replace what had been lost or damaged? And sometimes the answer to these questions was uncertain until it was tested. There were also moments when the fragility of travel became more visible through interaction with others. A disagreement at a toll point, a misunderstanding with a host, a refusal of service. These were not necessarily common, but when they occurred, they could interrupt the flow of the journey in ways that were difficult to resolve quickly. Conflict, even at a minor level, had consequences. It could delay progress, strain resources, or alter the traveler's perception of the road ahead. In a world where movement depended on a series of small agreements, permission to pass, to rest, to buy, to be guided, a breakdown in any one of those agreements could have a ripple effect. And yet, what is striking is not only that these disruptions occurred, but that travelers expected them to some degree. The medieval journey was not imagined as a smooth sequence of events. It was understood as something that would involve difficulty, adjustment, and occasional setback. This expectation shaped behavior. Travelers prepared not for perfection, but for variation. They carried tools for repair when possible. They allowed for extra time. They sought information not only about the ideal route, but about what to do if the ideal route failed. This does not mean that uncertainty was comfortable. It means that it was integrated into the experience. There is also a deeper, almost philosophical dimension to this. Medieval travel required a kind of acceptance, an understanding that control was partial, that plans were provisional, and that success depended as much on response as on intention. This acceptance was not passive. It was active, expressed through attentiveness, flexibility, and the ability to make decisions under changing conditions. A skilled traveler was not necessarily the one who moved fastest, but the one who managed uncertainty most effectively. And this skill was not evenly distributed. Experience mattered. Someone who had traveled before, who understood how roads behaved in different weather, who recognized signs of trouble in animals or equipment, who knew when to trust advice and when to question it, held an advantage that could not easily be replaced. But even experience had limits. There were always situations that fell outside expectation. A route that had always been reliable might suddenly become problematic. A region that had been safe might become unstable. A familiar pattern might break in ways that could not be predicted. In these moments, the traveler was confronted with the full reality of the road, not as a known system, but as an environment that could change independently of their knowledge or preparation. And it is here that we begin to see why medieval travel, despite its regularity and necessity, retained a sense of uncertainty that is difficult to fully capture in modern terms. It was not only that journeys took longer or that conditions were less comfortable. It was that the relationship between traveler and world was less controlled, less buffered, and more immediate. A modern traveler moves through systems designed to reduce variation, to standardize routes, to ensure safety, to provide predictable access to resources. The medieval traveler moved through systems that were partial, uneven, and often dependent on local conditions. This difference is subtle, but it changes everything. It means that each journey was, in a sense, unique, not entirely unpredictable, but never entirely repeatable. The same road could be experienced differently from one journey to the next, shaped by factors that lay beyond any single person's control. And yet, despite this variability, movement continued. Roads were used, goods were transported, people arrived at their destinations, even if not always on time, and not always in the condition they had hoped. This continuity suggests that fragility did not prevent travel. It defined its character. The medieval journey was not a failure of efficiency. It was a different kind of system, one that operated within the limits of its environment, its technology, and its social structures. And perhaps the most revealing aspect of that system is how it balanced difficulty with persistence. Travelers did not wait for perfect conditions. They moved within imperfect ones, adjusting as they went, carrying forward not only their belongings, but their knowledge, their expectations, and their willingness to continue. Because in the end, the road did not promise ease or certainty or even success. It offered only the possibility of movement, and the understanding that what happened next would depend, in ways both small and significant, on how each traveler responded to a world that was always, in some quiet way, in motion. That understanding that what happened next depended not only on intention, but on response, begins to reveal something even more subtle about medieval travel. The journey did not unfold as a straight line, but as a continuous series of thresholds. Each threshold marked a shift, sometimes small, sometimes more significant. Leaving a town meant entering open road, with fewer guarantees. Reaching a river meant pausing, negotiating, or adapting. Entering a new lordship meant adjusting to a different set of expectations. Even crossing from one type of terrain into another, a forest edge, a hillside path, a marshy stretch, required a quiet recalibration of pace and attention. These thresholds were not always formally marked. There were no clear signs announcing them. Instead, they were felt through change. The road surface altered underfoot. The density of travelers increased or decreased. The language in the air shifted slightly. The architecture of buildings became unfamiliar. Small details accumulated until the traveler recognized, sometimes only gradually, that they had entered a different context. And with each of these transitions came a renewed need for awareness. A traveler who moved too quickly across these boundaries, who failed to notice the change, risked making decisions that no longer suited the conditions they had entered. This is particularly visible when we consider the movement between rural and urban spaces. Approaching a town or city was not simply a matter of arrival. It was a transition into a different rhythm of life. Roads became more crowded. Activity increased. The presence of authority became more visible, whether through gates, guards, or officials responsible for managing entry. Entry itself could involve waiting, inspection, or payment. Goods might be examined. Intentions might be questioned. A traveler who had moved relatively freely through open countryside now encountered a point where movement was more explicitly regulated. Inside the town, the experience shifted again. Streets were narrower, often uneven, and filled with people, animals, and activity. Movement slowed not because of terrain but because of density. The traveler who had been alone or in a small group now became part of a larger flow, navigating space that was shared in a more immediate way. And yet, towns also offered something the open road could not: concentration. Goods, services, information, and opportunities were gathered in one place. A traveler might find better lodging, more reliable food, access to repair, or news that shaped the next stage of the journey. But these advantages came with their own complexities: cost, crowding, and the need to navigate unfamiliar social and economic systems. Leaving a town, in turn, meant another threshold. The relative structure and support of the urban environment gave way again to the variability of the road. The traveler carried forward what they had gained: supplies, information, rest, but also re-entered a space where those resources would once again be tested. This pattern repeated itself across different scales. A small village might offer a brief moment of stability between longer stretches of uncertainty. A monastery might provide structured hospitality within an otherwise unpredictable route. A well-maintained bridge might create a point of reliable passage within a landscape of shifting crossings. Each of these points acted as a kind of anchor, temporary, localized, but meaningful. Travelers oriented themselves around them, not always consciously, but through habit and experience. A known stopping point could shape how far one aimed to travel in a day. A reliable crossing could determine which route was chosen over another. And yet, these anchors were not fixed in the way modern infrastructure is, and it might change ownership or decline in quality. A bridge might fall into disrepair. A village might be affected by disease, conflict, or economic change. What had been reliable once might not remain so. This introduces another layer of subtle instability. Knowledge, even when accurate, had a kind of expiration. Travelers relied on what they knew, but also had to remain open to the possibility that what they knew might no longer apply. This is one reason why conversation was so important. Information needed to be refreshed, updated, tested against recent experience. A traveler arriving at a stopping point did not simply rest, they listened. They asked questions, compared accounts, and adjusted their expectations based on what they heard. In this way, the journey became a kind of dialogue, not only between traveler and landscape, but between travelers themselves. Each person contributed a fragment of knowledge, and through these exchanges, a more current understanding of the road emerged. But even this shared knowledge had limits. It was shaped by perspective. What was manageable for one traveler might be difficult for another. A route described as passable might be so for a lightly equipped rider, but far more challenging for someone with a heavy cart. A warning about danger might reflect a specific incident rather than a consistent condition. So the traveler had to interpret not only the landscape, but the information about it. They had to weigh advice, consider its source, and decide how it applied to their own situation. This continuous process of interpretation and adjustment is what gives medieval travel its particular character. It was not simply about moving through space. It was about navigating uncertainty at multiple levels: physical, social, and informational. And within this complexity, time itself took on a different quality. A journey was not experienced as a fixed schedule, but as a sequence of durations shaped by circumstance. A day's travel might be longer or shorter than expected, not because of distance alone, but because of how that distance unfolded. Delays were not always disruptions. They were part of the rhythm. Waiting, in particular, was an integral part of travel. Waiting for a ferry, waiting for weather to improve, waiting for companions, waiting for daylight. These pauses were not empty. They were filled with observation, conversation, and sometimes quiet reflection. But they also required patience, which was not simply a virtue, but a practical necessity. And for the medieval traveler, that approaching threshold was not something distant or abstract. It was something that could emerge within the next bend of the road, the next change in weather, or the next human encounter. What makes this particularly revealing is that, over time, travelers began to recognize not just the road itself, but the patterns of uncertainty that accompanied it. They learned to anticipate the kinds of disruptions that were likely, even if they could not predict their exact form. For instance, a stretch of road that crossed low ground might not always be impassable, but it carried a reputation. After rain, it slowed. After repeated use, it deepened into ruts that trapped wheels and strained animals. A traveler approaching such a place did not assume failure, but they adjusted their expectations. They might allow more time. They might prepare to assist their animal. They might choose to arrive earlier in the day, when energy was still available to manage difficulty. This kind of anticipation did not remove uncertainty, but it softened its impact. It transformed the unknown into something partially familiar, not because it was controlled, but because its possibility was understood. And yet, there were always limits to this familiarity. One of the most difficult aspects of medieval travel was the moment when expectation and reality diverged without warning. A road expected to be passable might be flooded. A known stopping place might be closed, full, or no longer in operation. A crossing might be unavailable for reasons that could not be easily discovered in advance. These moments required a different kind of response, one that moved beyond preparation into improvisation under pressure. A traveler arriving at a flooded road, for example, faced a series of immediate questions. Could the water be crossed safely? Was there an alternative route nearby? How far back would one need to go to find it? How much daylight remained? What resources were available to support a delay? Each question connected to the others. Choosing to attempt a crossing might save time, but risk injury or loss. Choosing to turn back might preserve safety, but consume precious daylight and energy. Waiting might allow conditions to improve, but require food, shelter, and patience that were not always available. What is striking here is how quickly a situation could shift from routine to consequential. A journey that had been proceeding steadily could, within a short span, require decisions that carried lasting effects. And yet, these were not rare occurrences. They were part of the structure of travel itself. This brings us to another important detail. The medieval traveler was rarely operating with a sense of guaranteed arrival. A destination existed, often clearly defined, but the path to it remained contingent. Reaching it required not only movement, but a series of successful negotiations with the conditions encountered along the way. This is one of the reasons why arrival, when it came, carried a different kind of meaning. It was not simply the end of a journey measured in distance. It was the completion of a process that had required sustained attention, adaptation, and endurance. But before arrival, there were always more thresholds. One of the more subtle thresholds involved visibility, not in the sense of seeing the road, but in being seen upon it. As a traveler moved through different regions, their presence became part of the environment. On busy routes, this might pass unnoticed, absorbed into the general flow. But on quieter roads, or in less frequented areas, the traveler could become a focal point of attention. Being observed was not necessarily negative. It could lead to assistance, to conversation, to offers of guidance. But it also meant that the traveler's actions, appearance, and behavior were being interpreted by others. A person who appeared confident and purposeful might be treated differently from one who seemed uncertain or out of place. Clothing, posture, the condition of animals, even the way one approached a settlement, all contributed to how a traveler was received. This created another layer of subtle decision-making. Presentation mattered not in a performative sense, but in a practical one. A traveler learned, often through experience, how to move in ways that reduced friction, how to approach a gate, how to ask for assistance, how to signal intent without creating suspicion. These skills were rarely formalized. They were part of what might be called the unwritten knowledge of travel, understandings that were shared informally, observed, and gradually internalized. And like all forms of knowledge in this world, they were shaped by variation. What worked in one region might not work in another. A gesture of respect in one place might be interpreted differently elsewhere. The traveler had to remain attentive, not only to the physical landscape, but to the social one. This social landscape could shift just as quickly as the physical one. A region might feel welcoming one day and more cautious the next, depending on local events. News of conflict, theft, or unrest could alter how travelers were perceived. A place that had been open might become guarded, not because of any change in the traveler, but because of changes in the environment through which they were moving. This again reinforces the idea that travel was not static. It was a dynamic interaction between movement and context. And within this interaction, time continued to unfold in a way that resisted precision. A traveler might plan to reach a certain point within a set number of days, but that plan remained flexible. Delays accumulated. Unexpected opportunities arose. A longer stay in one place might provide rest, information, or resources that justified the time spent. A shorter stay might preserve momentum but leave certain needs unmet. There was no single correct approach. The journey was shaped by a series of trade-offs, each made within the constraints of the moment. And yet, despite this complexity, there is a quiet consistency in how medieval travel progressed. It moved forward, not always smoothly, not always efficiently, but persistently. Each decision, each adjustment, each response to changing conditions contributed to that forward motion. Even setbacks became part of the process, shaping the path rather than ending it. And it is here, in this steady continuation despite uncertainty, that we begin to see something that is easy to miss when focusing only on the difficulties. Because while medieval travel was slower, dirtier, and more dangerous, it was also deeply intentional. Movement was rarely casual. It carried purpose, economic, religious, political, or personal, and that purpose provided a kind of direction that extended beyond the immediate conditions of the road. A traveler might face delays, discomfort, or risk, but the reason for the journey remained. And it is that reason, held quietly in the background of every step, that helped sustain the willingness to continue. Which means that as the road stretched ahead, with all its uncertainty, the traveler was not simply reacting to the world around them. They were also moving toward something that gave shape to the journey, even when the path itself remained uncertain, and even when the next threshold had not yet fully revealed what it would demand. That sense of moving toward something, held quietly beneath the strain of each day, begins to shape how we understand not just the act of travel, but the mindset required to endure it over long distances. Because purpose in the medieval journey was not a constant source of clarity. It did not eliminate doubt or difficulty. Instead, it coexisted with them. A pilgrim might walk with devotion, yet still feel the weight of exhaustion. A merchant might pursue profit, yet question each delay as costs accumulated. A messenger might carry urgency, yet be forced to slow by conditions that could not be overcome. This coexistence is important. It reminds us that medieval travelers were not immune to frustration or uncertainty. They experienced them fully. The difference lies in how those experiences were integrated into the journey rather than treated as interruptions to it. Over time, this produced a particular rhythm of expectation. Travelers did not anticipate a perfectly ordered progression. They anticipated variation. And within that variation, they learned to locate moments of relative stability, points where effort aligned more smoothly with progress. One such moment might occur early in the day, when the body was still responsive, the light was clear, and the road, if not ideal, was at least manageable. These hours often represented the most efficient period of travel, and experienced travelers took advantage of them, covering as much ground as conditions allowed before fatigue began to accumulate. As the day advanced, the rhythm shifted, pace slowed, attention became more focused not on distance but on arrival, on identifying where to stop, how far remained to the next settlement, and whether continuing would produce benefit or risk. This daily arc, repeated over time, created a kind of structure within the broader uncertainty of the journey. It did not remove unpredictability, but it provided a framework within which unpredictability could be managed. And yet, even within this structure, there were moments when the expected pattern did not hold. A traveler might begin the day with intention and clarity, only to find that within a few hours, conditions had shifted, weather turning, road deteriorating, or some unforeseen obstacle requiring attention. In such cases, the planned rhythm gave way to a more reactive mode, where decisions were made not according to ideal pacing, but according to immediate necessity. These moments often passed without record, but they were central to the experience of travel. They revealed how quickly a journey could move from predictable to uncertain, and how essential it was for the traveler to remain adaptable. There is also a quieter layer to this adaptability that becomes visible when we consider how travelers related to time itself. Modern travel is structured around precise schedules, departure times, arrival times, durations measured in hours and minutes. Medieval travel operated within a broader, less precise framework. Time was still measured, of course, but it was experienced more through cycles, daylight and darkness, seasons, the recurring patterns of effort and rest. This did not mean that time was unimportant. On the contrary, it was deeply significant, but it was understood as something that could not always be controlled. A traveler might intend to reach a destination by a certain point, but that intention was always subject to revision. Delays were not failures in the modern sense. They were part of the process, to be managed rather than eliminated. This difference in the experience of time shaped how journeys were perceived. Progress was not always linear. It included pauses, reversals, adjustments, moments where movement slowed or stopped, only to resume later under different conditions. And within this unfolding sequence, memory began to form not as a continuous line, but as a series of impressions. A difficult stretch of road, a welcoming inn, a challenging crossing, a conversation that altered the route ahead. These moments stood out, giving the journey a texture that was shaped as much by experience as by distance. For many travelers, these impressions were not incidental. They were the substance of the journey itself. And this leads us to another quiet truth. Medieval travel was not only physically demanding, but also deeply observational. A traveler who moved successfully through this world paid attention, not only to the road, but to the signs that indicated how the road might behave. The color of the ground, the pattern of tracks left by others, the movement of water, the condition of vegetation, each offered clues. This attentiveness was not formalized as a system. It was practical, learned through experience and reinforced through necessity. A traveler who failed to observe closely might still move forward, but with greater risk. One who observed well could anticipate difficulty, adjust earlier, and move with a degree of confidence that reduced uncertainty, even if it did not remove it entirely. And yet, observation had its limits. There were always moments when the signs were unclear, when the road did not reveal its condition until it was already being tested, when the next stretch of terrain concealed more than it showed. In these moments, the traveler encountered the full complexity of the journey, not as something that could be fully understood in advance, but as something that had to be engaged with directly. This engagement required more than knowledge. It required judgment. Judgment in this context was not a fixed quality. It was shaped by experience, by current conditions, and by the traveler's own state of mind and body. A decision that was sound under one set of circumstances might be less effective under another. And so the journey continued, shaped by a continuous interplay between what was known, what was observed, and what had to be decided in the moment. There is a quiet humility in this process. It reflects an understanding that control is partial, that knowledge is incomplete, and that success depends on navigating that incompleteness with care. And yet, despite this humility, there is also a quiet confidence. Not the confidence of certainty, but the confidence that comes from having moved through uncertainty before, from having faced difficult roads, unexpected delays, and changing conditions, and having found ways to continue. This confidence did not eliminate difficulty. It made it manageable. And it is this balance between uncertainty and experience, between difficulty and persistence, that gives medieval travel its distinctive character. Because even as the road remained unpredictable, the traveler developed a relationship with that unpredictability, a way of moving through it that was neither entirely controlled nor entirely reactive. And as that relationship deepened, something else began to emerge, not an end to uncertainty, but a growing sense of how to live within it, how to continue forward even when the path ahead remained only partially known, and how to recognize, in the shifting conditions of the journey, the next decision that would carry them further along the road. And it is in that growing sense of learning how to live within uncertainty rather than overcome it, that the medieval journey begins to reveal one of its most overlooked features. It quietly trained the traveler, not in a formal sense and not with any intention of instruction, but through repetition, exposure, and consequence. Each day on the road refined something: awareness, patience, judgment, endurance. Mistakes were rarely abstract. They had weight. They cost time, energy, or resources. And because of that, they were remembered. A traveler who misjudged distance early in a journey might begin to develop a more careful sense of pacing. One who trusted unreliable advice might become more selective in whom they listened to. Someone who ignored early signs of fatigue might learn, perhaps uncomfortably, the importance of stopping before exhaustion took hold. This process of quiet correction created a kind of experiential knowledge that was difficult to transfer fully from one person to another. Advice could be given, certainly. Routes could be described. Warnings could be shared. But the deeper understanding, the one that shaped how a traveler felt the road, came only through movement itself. And this is where we begin to see a subtle distinction between knowing about a journey and having made one. A person who had not traveled might understand that roads could be muddy, that distances were long, that dangers existed. But they would not yet have internalized how those factors combined. They would not know how a seemingly short stretch of difficult ground could alter an entire day's progress, or how a small delay could ripple forward into the next several stages of the journey. The experienced traveler, by contrast, carried this understanding in a practical, almost intuitive form. They did not need to calculate every possibility. They recognized patterns. They sensed when something was slightly off, when a road felt heavier than expected, when the timing of the day was slipping, when a decision needed to be made sooner rather than later. This sensitivity was not infallible, but it was valuable. It allowed the traveler to respond earlier, to adjust before a problem became more difficult to manage. And yet, even as this experience accumulated, it did not create mastery in the modern sense. The medieval traveler did not reach a point where the road became fully predictable. Instead, they reached a point where unpredictability became more familiar. This distinction matters because it changes how we understand skill in this context. Skill was not about eliminating uncertainty. It was about navigating it more effectively. There is also a quiet social dimension to this learning. Travelers did not develop their understanding in isolation. They observed others. They listened. They compared experiences. A conversation at an inn might reveal how someone else had handled a similar difficulty. A shared journey might expose different approaches to pacing, to rest, to decision-making. Over time, this created a kind of informal culture of travel, an accumulation of practices, expectations, and shared understandings that existed alongside the physical routes themselves. This culture was not uniform. It varied by region, by purpose, and by the kinds of people who traveled most frequently along certain paths. A merchant route might develop different norms than a pilgrimage route. A heavily used road might feel more structured than a less traveled one. But across these variations, there was a common thread: the recognition that travel required more than movement. It required engagement with the environment, with other people, and with one's own limits. And it is within this engagement that another layer of the journey becomes visible. Because as travelers adapted to the road itself, in a subtle way, adapted to them. Paths became more defined through repeated use. Stopping places gained or lost importance based on patterns of movement. Information about conditions, routes, and practices accumulated, shaping how future travelers approached the same spaces. This was not a rapid transformation, and it was not centrally directed. It was gradual, emerging from the repeated interaction between people and place. In this sense, medieval travel was not static. It was part of a living system, one that evolved slowly as experience accumulated and was shared. And yet, this evolution did not remove the fundamental constraints we have been exploring. Roads remained imperfect. Weather remained variable. Authority remained uneven. The body remained limited. What changed was not the elimination of difficulty, but the refinement of how difficulty was approached. And this refinement had its own limits, because there were always travelers at the beginning of their experience, individuals for whom the road was still unfamiliar, whose judgments had not yet been shaped by repetition, and who were encountering these conditions for the first time. For them, the journey could feel more uncertain, more demanding, and more difficult to interpret. They relied more heavily on guidance, on visible signs, and on the assistance of others. This creates an interesting layering within medieval travel. At any given moment, the road held both the experienced and the inexperienced, those who had learned its patterns and those who were still discovering them. Their interactions contributed to the ongoing flow of knowledge, but also to the variability of experience. A group might move at the pace of its least experienced member. Advice might be shaped by differing levels of understanding. Decisions might reflect a combination of confidence and uncertainty. And through all of this, the journey continued, shaped not by a single narrative, but by many overlapping ones. There is also a quieter, almost reflective quality that begins to emerge when we consider how travelers related to their own progress over time. A journey of any length created distance not only in space, but in experience. The person who set out at the beginning was not quite the same as the one who moved further along the road. Not transformed in a dramatic sense, but adjusted, more aware, more attuned to the patterns of movement, more capable of interpreting what lay ahead. This change was not always consciously recognized. It was embedded in action, in the way decisions were made, in the way attention was directed, in the way the traveler responded to familiar and unfamiliar conditions alike. And it is this gradual adjustment that brings us closer to understanding why medieval travel, despite all its challenges, remained a central part of life. Because the road, difficult as it was, did not only take from the traveler. It also gave something back, not in comfort or certainty, but in experience, in understanding, and in a kind of practical awareness that could not be acquired in any other way. And as that awareness deepened, the traveler moved forward not just with a destination in mind, but with a growing sense of how to meet whatever the next stretch of the road might require, even as it remained just out of view, waiting to reveal itself in its own time. And that next stretch of road, when it finally came into view, was rarely as simple as it first appeared. Because one of the most quietly deceptive features of medieval travel was how often the visible distance concealed the true difficulty of reaching it. A town might be seen from miles away, its towers or walls rising above the surrounding land, offering a clear sense of direction. But what lay between the traveler and that destination was not always revealed at first glance. A field that looked firm might be softened beneath the surface. A path that seemed direct might curve unexpectedly around obstacles. A descent that appeared gentle from a distance might prove uneven underfoot. The eye could guide the traveler, but it could not always predict the experience of the ground itself. This gap between appearance and reality created a particular kind of tension. The traveler could see where they were going, but not fully understand what it would take to get there. And this was not limited to landscapes. It extended to people, to places, and to expectations more broadly. An inn, for example, might be known by reputation, described as reliable, welcoming, or well-provisioned. But reputation did not always match experience. Conditions changed. Ownership shifted. Circumstances varied. A traveler arriving with certain expectations might find that reality differed in ways that affected rest, cost, or comfort. Similarly, a road described as good might be so under certain conditions, but less so under others. A stretch that had been manageable weeks earlier might have deteriorated. A crossing that had been straightforward might now require caution. This does not mean that information was unreliable in a careless sense. It means that it was context-dependent, and this context dependence required the traveler to maintain a kind of cautious flexibility, an openness to revising expectations without becoming disoriented by the change. There is a quiet discipline in this. It is not the discipline of strict adherence to a plan, but the discipline of responsive adjustment. A traveler who clung too tightly to expectation risked frustration or poor decisions. One who abandoned expectation entirely risked losing direction. The balance lay somewhere in between, holding a general sense of purpose while remaining attentive to the reality unfolding at each step. This balance becomes particularly important as journeys lengthen. Over time, the accumulation of small adjustments begins to shape the overall trajectory of the journey in ways that are not always immediately visible. A slightly slower pace here, a longer rest there, a detour taken or avoided, each contributes to a gradual shift in timing and experience. The traveler who set out with a rough sense of how long a journey might take often found that the actual duration was shaped by these accumulated variations. And yet, despite this, journeys were completed. Not always on schedule, not always as originally imagined, but completed nonetheless. This persistence is one of the more revealing aspects of medieval travel. It suggests that success was not defined by precision, but by continuation. A journey was successful not because it followed a perfect line, but because it held together, because the traveler managed to navigate the variations, absorb the disruptions, and continue moving forward. And within this process, a certain kind of resilience emerged. Not resilience in the sense of resistance to difficulty, but resilience in the sense of adaptation to it. The traveler did not expect the road to become easier. They expected themselves to become more capable of moving within its constraints. This expectation shaped behavior in subtle ways. A traveler might carry a little more than strictly necessary, not because it made the journey easier, but because it provided a margin for uncertainty. They might choose a route that was longer but more reliable, valuing consistency over speed. They might stop earlier than planned, recognizing that preserving strength was more important than maximizing distance on any single day. These choices, individually modest, collectively created a more sustainable approach to travel. And sustainability in this context was essential. because the journey was not measured in moments of effort, but in the ability to sustain effort over time. There is also an interesting interplay between individual and shared experience here. While each traveler navigated their own path, the accumulation of many journeys created patterns that influenced future travel. Routes became established not through design alone, but through repeated use. Stopping points gained significance because travelers returned to them. Information circulated, gradually refining collective understanding. In this way, the medieval road was shaped not only by geography and authority, but by memory, by the experiences of those who had moved along it before. And yet, memory itself was imperfect. What was remembered might emphasize certain details over others. Difficult experiences might stand out more than routine ones. Advice passed from one traveler to another might be simplified, generalized, or adapted to fit new contexts. This means that even the shared knowledge of the road carried its own uncertainties. A traveler relying on that knowledge had to interpret it, to test it against their own experience, and to adjust as necessary. This continuous process of interpretation is what gives medieval travel its distinctive texture. It was not simply a matter of following a path. It was a matter of engaging with that path, of reading it, responding to it, and, in a small way, contributing to its ongoing definition. And within this engagement, there is a quiet shift that takes place. The road, initially experienced as something external, something to be crossed or endured, begins to feel more familiar. Not predictable, but recognizable. A traveler who has moved through different terrains, encountered various conditions, and navigated multiple uncertainties begins to develop a sense of how these elements fit together. They may not know exactly what lies ahead, but they understand the kinds of things that might lie ahead and how to respond to them. This understanding does not eliminate difficulty, but it changes its character. Difficulty becomes something to be managed rather than feared. And yet, even with this growing familiarity, the road retains its capacity to surprise. There are always moments when something unexpected emerges, when the terrain behaves differently, when an encounter alters the course of the journey, when a small detail becomes more significant than anticipated. These moments remind the traveler that, no matter how much experience has been gained, the journey remains open. It is never fully contained by knowledge or expectation. And it is in this openness that the medieval journey continues to unfold, not as a fixed sequence of events, but as a living process shaped by movement, by response, and by the quiet interplay between intention and circumstance. So as the traveler moves forward, carrying with them both purpose and experience, the road ahead remains what it has always been. Partly known, partly uncertain, and always ready to ask something new of those who step onto it. And when that something new finally revealed itself, it often did so in ways that were not dramatic at first glance, but quietly decisive over time. A change in wind direction, a subtle shift in the firmness of the ground, the absence of other travelers on a route that was usually busy. These were not events that announced themselves as turning points. They were signals, small, often ambiguous, but meaningful to those who had learned to notice them. The experienced traveler understood that these signals rarely stood alone. They formed patterns. A firmer wind combined with darkening clouds might suggest incoming rain. Fewer travelers on the road might indicate trouble ahead, or a change in seasonal movement. Ground that felt slightly unstable could point to a stretch that would grow more difficult further on. Recognizing these patterns did not eliminate uncertainty, but it allowed the traveler to act earlier, to slow down, to prepare, or to reconsider the path ahead before difficulty became unavoidable. This is where the journey begins to feel less like a sequence of reactions and more like a continuous act of reading. The road was not silent. Communicated through condition, through absence, through variation. The traveler, in turn, responded not always consciously, but through decisions shaped by attention. And yet, This act of reading required energy. It depended on the traveler's ability to remain alert, to interpret what they saw and felt, and to translate that into action. As fatigue accumulated, this ability could diminish. Signs might be missed. Judgments might become less precise. Decisions might be delayed. This creates another subtle layer of difficulty. Travel was not only about physical endurance, but about sustaining awareness over time. A traveler who could walk further but observed less carefully might face greater risk than one who moved more slowly but remained attentive. In this sense, speed and safety were not always aligned. This tension appears again when we consider the presence or absence of other people on the road. A well-traveled route offered a kind of informal reassurance. Other travelers could confirm direction, share information, and provide a sense of shared movement. Their presence suggested that the path was still in use, still viable. But even this reassurance carried complexity. More travelers meant more information, but also more competition, for space at inns, for resources, for safe passage through narrow routes. Crowded conditions could increase the spread of illness, strain local supplies, or create delays at crossings and toll points. Conversely, an empty road offered space and quiet, but also isolation. A traveler moving alone through a less frequented area faced greater uncertainty. If something went wrong, assistance might not be immediately available. The absence of others could signal safety, or it could signal that the route was being avoided for reasons not yet understood. And so, even the presence or absence of company required interpretation. There is also a deeper temporal layer to this. Roads were not used evenly throughout the year. Movement followed patterns, market cycles, religious calendars, agricultural demands, and seasonal conditions. A route that was active at one time might be quiet at another. A town that was busy during a fair might be much calmer at other times. A pilgrimage route might see waves of travelers during certain seasons and fewer at others. This meant that the traveler was not only moving through space, but through time as structured by movement. Arriving at a place at the right time could mean access to resources, information, and support. Arriving at the wrong time might mean scarcity, delay, or isolation. But timing, again, was not always within the traveler's control. Delays earlier in the journey could shift arrival into less favorable conditions. A missed opportunity, a market day, a ferry crossing, a safe window of weather, might not be easily recovered. And yet, even within these constraints, the journey continued. This continuity reveals something important about the relationship between expectation and experience. Medieval travelers did not assume that everything would align perfectly. They assumed that alignment would be partial, and that part of the journey would involve working within that partial alignment. This expectation shaped resilience in a quiet way. It did not remove disappointment or difficulty, but it reduced the shock of encountering them. A delay was not an unexpected failure. It was part of the structure of travel. And because of this, travelers developed ways of absorbing disruption without losing direction. They adjusted plans. They reevaluated routes. They made use of what was available. They continued. This continuation, however, was not automatic. It required decision after decision, each one made within a specific context, each one carrying its own implications. And over time, these decisions accumulated into something that could only be understood in retrospect. A traveler might look back on a journey and recognize how a series of small choices, some deliberate, some reactive, had shaped the overall experience. A path taken, a delay accepted, an encounter embraced or avoided, each contributed to the final outcome. But during the journey itself, that larger pattern was rarely visible. The traveler moved within the present, responding to immediate conditions, carrying forward a sense of purpose that extended beyond what could be seen at any given moment. And it is this combination of immediate responsiveness and longer-term intention that gives medieval travel its distinctive rhythm. The traveler was always both in the moment and moving towards something beyond it. They could not see the entire path, but they carried a direction. They could not control every condition, but they shaped their response to those conditions. And as they continued, step by step, through a landscape that never fully revealed itself in advance, the journey unfolded not as a fixed route, but as an evolving experience, one in which each new stretch of road brought with it not just distance, but another quiet opportunity to observe, to decide, and to continue forward into whatever came next. And over time, as one stretch of road gave way to another, and each decision quietly shaped the next, something almost unnoticeable began to settle into place. The journey, which at the beginning had felt uncertain, even slightly overwhelming, became familiar. Not easier exactly. The mud was still there. The delays still came. The body still tired. The risks did not disappear. But the traveler no longer met these things as surprises. They met them as part of the world. And that quiet shift is perhaps the most revealing part of medieval travel. Because when we say it was slower, dirtier, and more dangerous, what we are really describing is not just the condition of the road, but the absence of the systems that now protect us from it. There were no guarantees of timing, no assurance of comfort, no invisible network smoothing every surface, bridging every gap, or solving every problem before it reached you. Instead, there was only the road itself and your ability to move within it, to notice, to adjust, to continue. And what begins to emerge from that is not just a story about hardship, but a different relationship with movement entirely. Travel was not something that happened for you. It was something you participated in. Every mile required your attention. Every day required your judgment. Every decision mattered, even when it felt small. And yet, despite all of that, or perhaps because of it, people kept going. Merchants crossed regions again and again, building trade through persistence rather than speed. Pilgrims walked for weeks or months, not because the journey was easy, but because its difficulty gave it meaning. Messengers carried information across landscapes that resisted quick movement, ensuring that kingdoms, cities, and communities remained connected, even at a slower pace. And ordinary people, farmers, laborers, families, moved when they needed to, navigating the same roads, making the same decisions, carrying the same quiet uncertainties. So when we look back at medieval travel, it is easy to focus on what it lacked. Speed, comfort, safety. But perhaps what it offers, if we look more closely, is a different perspective. A reminder that movement was once something deeply physical, deeply attentive, and deeply human. That every journey required not just direction, but presence. And that reaching a destination was never just about getting there. It was about everything that had to be managed, endured, and understood along the way. So the next time you imagine a traveler on a medieval road, moving slowly, clothes worn, path uncertain, it may help to see not just the difficulty, but the quiet skill behind it. Because that traveler was not simply enduring the journey. They were navigating it, step by step, through a world that never fully made the path easy, but always allowed it to continue. And if you've stayed with this journey, I'd be genuinely curious, what part of medieval travel felt the hardest to imagine living through? And if you enjoy these calm, deeper explorations into history, you're always welcome to stay for the next one.